In 1984, a company sold a box on a truck frame and called it the future of the family car. It had the ride quality of a tractor, the fuel economy of a small aircraft, and a name that sounded like it belonged to a national park. That car is the Jeep Cherokee, and it accidentally created the most successful product category in the history of the automobile by exploiting a loophole nobody thought anyone would want to exploit anyway. Today, that loophole has eaten the sedan, the hatchback, the station wagon, and increasingly, your ability to see a child crossing the street in front of your car. In the US, over 4 out of 5 new vehicles sold are legally classified as trucks. Globally, almost 1 in 2 cars rolling off the lot in 2023 was an SUV, a record which was broken again just the following year. Before we get to it, a quick definitional reset because the term SUV has been stretched so far it's basically meaningless now. Modern SUVs are to first gen SUVs what pugs are to wolves. The original sports utility vehicle was never invented for suburban parents. It was a legal and, most importantly, a functional descendant of the military Jeep and post-war farm trucks. Vehicles like the Jeep Wagoneer and the Chevy Suburban, built on truck chassis, designed to go where roads didn't, and sold in tiny numbers to ranchers, hunters, and the Forest Service. But in 1975, in response to the oil embargo, the US Congress created the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standard, or CAFE. It split every vehicle sold in America into two buckets. Passenger cars got one set of strict, ever-rising fuel economy targets, while light trucks, a category meant for farm equipment and work vehicles, got a much looser set because regulators assumed that a plumber's pickup truck shouldn't be held to the same standard as a family sedan, which at the time, that assumption was valid. Light trucks were maybe 20% of the market, mostly bought by people who actually needed to carry lumber. Nobody expected them to become the vehicle a dentist drives his kids to soccer practice in. Lee Iacocca, running Chrysler in the early 1980s, realized something that regulators hadn't planned for. The light truck classification wasn't defined by what a vehicle was for. It was defined by a checklist: cargo capacity, removable seats, certain suspension specs. If you built a passenger vehicle that technically checked those boxes but instead used it to haul your kids around to school and back, you got the truck classification and the much looser fuel rules, while selling it to the exact same suburban family who would have bought a station wagon. And that is how the minivan was born. The SUV followed the same math a few years later. And the 1984 Jeep Cherokee proved you could put 4 doors and carpeted seats on a truck frame and sell it to people who'd never seen nor will ever see a dirt road. Automakers noticed the margins immediately. Trucks and SUVs didn't just dodge stricter fuel rules. They carried far fatter profit margins than sedans, often 2 to 3 times as much per unit, because the platforms were cheap to engineer relative to what the buyer was willing to pay for the image of ruggedness and space. A sedan is a commodity, an SUV, when marketed correctly, is a whole lifestyle. By the 2000s, the loophole had a second engine bolted onto it: the US tax code. Section 179 let small business owners deduct the full purchase price of a vehicle over £6,000 in its first year, a provision which was aimed at farm and work trucks that instead turned into a well-known trick for writing off a luxury Range Rover or Suburban as a business expense. Auto forums still call it the Hummer loophole after the vehicle that made it famous. In 2012, regulators tried to close the gap with something called the footprint rule, fuel economy targets based on a vehicle's physical size, meaning bigger vehicles get easier targets. The intent was to stop automakers from just building tiny trucks to dodge the rules. The actual effect, documented by the EPA's own regulatory analysis, was the opposite. It rewarded automakers for making vehicles larger, because a bigger footprint bought you a laxer target. Between 2011 and 2021, the share of new US vehicle sales classified as light trucks SUVs, pickups, vans, they went from about 53 to 63%. It's over 80% today if you want to count crossovers. Put very plainly, for 50 years, the regulators weaponized their own incompetence and told automakers that big and tall is simply cheaper to comply with, cheaper to build relative to the price, and more profitable to sell. You didn't get an SUV epidemic because Americans woke up one day desperate for towing capacity. You got it because every incentive in the system pointed towards the same direction, and companies are extremely good at following incentives. Here's where the case study, it stops being about spreadsheets and starts being about just plain physics. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety studied nearly 18,000 pedestrian crashes and found that vehicles with a hood height above 40 inches are 45% more likely to kill a pedestrian they hit than vehicles with hood height of 30 inches or less and a sloped front end. A separate 2024 economic analysis found that every additional 4 inches of front end height raises pedestrian death risk by roughly 22%. US pedestrian deaths rose about 80% between 2009 and the early 2020s, climbing even as deaths in most other crash categories stayed flatter. And that climb tracks almost exactly with the growth curve of SUVs and pickups on American roads. Over the past 3 decades, the average American passenger vehicle got roughly 4 inches wider, 10 inches longer, and 8 inches taller, and about 1,000 pounds heavier. A 2022 study found children are 8 times more likely to die when struck by an SUV than by a passenger car, largely because a tall, blunt front end hits a small body in the torso or head instead of the legs, and because these vehicles have comically large front blind zones. Advocacy groups have run demonstrations lining up more than a dozen children directly in front of a large SUV, invisible to the driver in the seat. None of this shows up in a Super Bowl commercial. The commercial shows the SUV climbing a mountain at golden hour. It unfortunately does not show the compliance spreadsheet or the blind zone diagram, or the pedestrian fatality trend line sitting right next to it on the same timeline. Zoom out from any single country and the pattern gets almost absurd. According to the International Energy Agency, SUVs made up 48% of all new car sales globally in 2023, a record. And they crossed 50% of new sales in wealthy countries for the first time ever. There are now more than 360 million SUVs on the roads worldwide, and in 2023 alone, they were responsible for roughly 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions. The IEA's own farming, if the global SUV fleet were a country, its annual emissions would rank 5th in the world, ahead of both Japan and Germany. The efficiency gains everyone assumes are happening, smaller engines, hybrid drivetrains, better aerodynamics, are being actively cancelled out. SUVs weigh 2 to 300 kilograms more than an equivalent mid-sized car, and they emit roughly 20% more CO2 on average, simply because physics doesn't care about your marketing. Even the shift to EVs isn't really escaping this. More than half of new electric vehicle sales globally in 2023 were SUVs, meaning the industry is now decarbonizing the engine while simultaneously making the vehicle around it more heavier and resource intensive. Bigger battery, more lithium and cobalt, and the most underreported pollutant, more tire particulate. Between 2022 and 2023, SUV-related demand alone pushed global oil consumption up by over 600,000 barrels a day. More than a quarter of the entire year's growth in oil demand came from this one vehicle category getting bigger. A handful of cities have started fighting back on pure practicality grounds, not ideology. Paris tripled parking charges specifically for large heavy vehicles after a 2022 referendum. France and Norway have weight-based taxes that scale punitively for anything over roughly 2 tons. It's a small counter-trend against a very large wave. Now, this part is what makes the SUV epidemic genuinely a global epidemic, according to me at least, because India arrived at exactly the same destination despite arguably having an automotive consumer market which is the polar opposite of the US. India is an incredibly difficult market for automotive companies due to a pretty simple misunderstanding. Historically, manufacturers considered the Indian consumer market to be price conscious and hence tried to create and dump substandard products for the longest time. And maybe that was true at one point of time, but post the 2000s, that statement could not be further from the truth. India is no longer a price conscious market, it is purely a value conscious market. Indians will pay a premium as long as the market deems the product to have value. It's why dirt cheap products like the Tata Nano and the entire fleet of cars introduced by Datsun failed so horrifically. So, what else does value mean? It entails countless parameters such as fuel efficiency, safety, reliability, resale value, ease of maintenance, and a parameter which has gained a lot of attention of late: societal value. There is no cafe loophole driving Indian buyers. There is no tax code rewarding a 6,000 pound curb weight. Indian SUVs are, on average, dramatically smaller than their American counterparts. The compact SUV, typically under 4 meters long to qualify for a lower excise slab, is the best selling body style in the country. And it's basically a jacked up hatchback. The Indian consumer market has deemed SUVs to have value. According to the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, utility vehicles, the SIAM term covering SUVs and MPVs, made up about 60% of India's passenger vehicle sales in the 2022 to 2023 year. In 2024 to 2025, that climbed to 65%. By 2025, industry figures put it above 66%, while plain passenger cars like hatchbacks and sedans actually shrank in absolute volume, down over 14% in a single year, even as the overall market around it kept growing. The hatchback, once the default first car for an entire generation of Indian buyers, has cratered from roughly 47% of the market share in 2018 to about a quarter of it right now. First-time buyers are skipping the hatchback step entirely and going straight to a sub 4 meter SUV because the on-road price gap has narrowed to almost nothing. The drivers here are different, but they rhyme with the American story regardless. Ground clearance is a genuine functional need on a lot of Indian roads, especially during monsoon flooding. That part is very real, but layered on top of it is the same status signaling mechanic the IA cites as one of the top drivers of the global SUV demand. A compact SUV sits psychologically above a hatchback for a price difference that's shrinking every year. The Mahindra Thar and the Toyota Fortuner are objectively not the best vehicles to commute in on Indian roads. The Thar has taken a lot of inspiration from the Jeep Wrangler, enough that Jeep itself raised IP concerns. And while it's not as hardcore as the Wrangler, it's still fundamentally an off-road vehicle, a genuinely great one, especially for the price. But it's not built for narrow Indian roads. It has middling fuel efficiency, and it isn't even nearly as comfortable as a sedan. And it can never be because it is an SUV. While the Toyota Fortuner still rides on Toyota's Hilux-derived IMV ladder frame platform, a lineage that traces back to the mid-2000s, which is still sold brand new from showrooms in 2026, with the top trim pushing past 50 lakhs, which for context is more than a new BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe or a Mercedes A-Class limousine, all genuinely modern platforms. And on low trim, this car still ships with wired-only Android Auto and CarPlay. But these two cars still sell immensely regardless. Why? Because despite these SUVs being actively penalized by the Indian government and being objectively inconvenient or outdated, the Indian market has decided that they're worth it. Because when you buy a Thar or a Fortuner or any other big SUV, you're not just buying a car, you're buying the image of being more important than a lowly sedan, the lowly hatchback, or a bike. It's why when you see one in your rearview mirror, you move out of the way. Not because you feel inferior, but because if you don't, the person driving might get offended that you fail to pay proper heed to the image of his car that lives in his head and end up actively trying to run you over. It's an entire stereotype, genuinely, just search it up. Just search up Indian car accidents and take a shot every time a Mahindra Thar or a Toyota Fortuner shows up. You'll get alcohol poisoning in 10 minutes. And before people take these opinions personally, let me remind you.
How do you know what's good for me? That's my opinion!
So strip away the specific vehicle and you're left with a template that shows up constantly in categories that have nothing to do with cars. A system draws a line to solve one narrow problem: protect small farms, protect small truck buyers, keep gas prices politically manageable, give small businesses a tax break, a taller car to tackle improper infrastructure. And the line becomes a target the moment it becomes a financial incentive. Whoever can position themselves closest to the exploitable side of that line wins, regardless of whether it serves the original intent. Minivan as tax dodge became SUV as tax dodge, became SUV as status symbol, became SUV as default. And at no point did a single actor need to be doing anything illegal or even unusual. Well, at least most actors. Every automaker was just following the incentive gradient that regulators, tax authorities, and the consumer psychology built for them, one small profitable decision at a time. Multiply that by 50 years and 40 countries, and you get a genuinely absurd outcome. The median new car in the world's largest market is now legally a truck, pedestrian deaths have risen for a decade and a half, and the emissions math on the industry's own electrification push is being quietly cancelled out by the vehicles getting heavier at the same rate that they're getting cleaner. Nobody designed this outcome on purpose. That's usually how the biggest systemic distortions work. Just decades of rational actors optimizing for a rule that stopped matching reality a really long time ago, and nobody with the incentive to go back and try to fix it. So next time someone tells you they bought an SUV for the safety, it's worth asking, safety for who? The occupant? Yeah, almost certainly. Everyone standing outside the vehicle? Increasingly and certainly, absolutely not. Now, that's been about the SUV epidemic. It's not a conspiracy, just 50 years of rational people following a rule that stopped making sense a long time ago. So, if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one.